Tensions between Russia and the US are at an all-time high. While the West fears a Russian invasion of Ukraine, Moscow insists that it will not start a war, but warns that it will not allow the West to trample on its security interests. Weeks of diplomacy have done little to douse tensions. So what will be America's strategy in handling the conflict over Ukraine? Will sanctions be imposed on Russia? These are just some of the questions that we'll try and answer. Welcome to our weekly broadcast of the WION-VOA co-production with me, Priyanka Sharma. Let's get started now. China is watching with great interest as Russia and the West face off over Ukraine. Beijing is engaged with its own territorial disputes and has offered political support for Moscow. But as Henry Ridgwell reports for Voice of America, China has also invested billions of dollars in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which could be at risk in the event of any conflict. More details in this next report.
Western nations have threatened unprecedented economic sanctions against Moscow if it invades Ukraine. If cut off by the West, could Russia look east to China for help?
The policy I think China is likely to take is to do whatever they can to help the Russians to face up to the economic sanctions that the US and Europeans may impose on Russia.
China has offered political support for Moscow in its standoff over Ukraine.
This foreign policy coordination will definitely increase. Because from the Russian perspective, intensification of the military partnership between Russia and China is precisely one of the major pains which Russia can inflict to the United States and NATO.
Meanwhile, China is closely watching NATO and America's response to any Russian invasion.
Even though there's these troop deployments to Eastern European states, no states are talking about directly sending troops into Ukraine itself to defend. And of course, China is taking note of that with some of their own territorial disputes in their own area.
Taiwan is China's biggest territorial dispute. And there is a risk of miscalculation as Beijing watches events unfold in Ukraine, says Steve Tsang.
The Chinese seeing the Americans and the Europeans talking big, but not doing very much about it, which would embolden them over Taiwan and potentially miscalculate what the American responses to a crisis over Taiwan might be.
Despite their mutual rivalry with the US, China and Russia's interests don't always align. Beijing's multi-trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative cut through several former Soviet bloc states, including Ukraine. A direct rail and ferry freight link opened in 2016, linking China with Ukraine's Black Sea coast via Georgia, Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, bypassing Russia. China has also funded infrastructure projects, including a new metro line for Kiev. If Russia invades Ukraine, could Beijing's investments in the region be at risk?
The more immediate impact on the Belt and Road Initiative would in fact be the Russian military intervention in Kazakhstan. And the Chinese government actually have shown that they are quite relaxed and comfortable with that. To them, it's more important to support authoritarian states and autocrats to stay in power, and then for some of them to be closer to Russia than to China at the moment. Over the longer term, things may change.
In the short term, analysts say China is keen to keep a lid on the simmering tensions for at least the next few weeks as it prepares to host the Winter Olympics. Henry Ridgwell for VOA News, London.
For more on this story, we're now joined by Voice of America's correspondent Chris Casquejo from Washington. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken told reporters earlier that whether Russia chooses the path of diplomacy and dialogue or whether they decide to renew aggression against Ukraine, the U.S. is prepared. Either ways, so what could be the next step when it comes to finding a diplomatic solution to this conflict?
Good morning from Washington, D.C. The White House says U.S. President Biden warned Ukraine's president Thursday that there is a distinct possibility Russia could take military action against Ukraine in February. The U.S. also announced that the UN Security Council will hold an open meeting Monday to discuss the situation. President Biden and Russian leader Vladimir Putin could meet virtually for a third time following 2 calls last month. And Ukraine's foreign minister confirmed it had seen the U.S. response to Russia's demands before it was sent, which U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken confirmed. Officials from Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany held talks Wednesday in Paris and agreed to another round of talks in Berlin. Ukraine's foreign minister took that news to express his view that Russia will likely remain on the diplomatic track for at least the next 2 weeks. But the U.S. and European allies are preparing for the possibility of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. NATO, the 30-nation Western military alliance, said it was boosting its presence in the Baltic Sea region, and the U.S. has ordered 8,500 troops to be on heightened alert for deployment to Europe as part of a NATO operation. A senior U.S. State Department official noted that Russian President Vladimir Putin may not want to upset China when the country is hosting the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics, which Putin is expected to attend.
Right. Now, Chris, many European countries depend on Russia for natural gas, which is, of course, a crucial component in this crisis. So what is being done to help them in the event that supplies are cut off or limited for that matter?
U.S. officials are working to ease any potential disruptions of Russia's supplied natural gas to Europe. If needed, Europe could look to natural gas supplies in North Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and the United States. Australia's trade minister announced Thursday that the country is ready to increase its supply of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, to the European Union. The EU depends on Russia for about a third of its natural gas supplies. Australia, the United States, and Qatar together supply about 50% of the world's LNG as shipped natural gas. Russia's gas exports to Europe are mostly pumped through pipelines that go through Ukraine or other Eastern European nations. And Moscow has insisted that the Ukrainian system was dilapidated and has accused Ukraine of stealing gas. Analysts have said that Russia could be using tensions over Ukraine to promote its plan for a new gas pipeline to Germany that bypasses Poland and Ukraine. Priyanka?
Right, Chris, thanks so much for those inputs. Stay with us on this broadcast. We'd like you to get us more inputs on the COVID crisis in America as it stands. Now, moving on, according to the CDC COVID data tracker, the average number of daily new COVID cases in the United States fluctuated between 750,000 and 800,000 in mid-January. Children under the age of 5 remain one of the most vulnerable groups since they cannot be vaccinated yet. In the first week of January, more than 500,000 young children were diagnosed with COVID, an 80% increase when compared to late December last year. Voice of America brings us more details in this next story. Take a look.
In August, at just 3 months old, Baker Mills entered an Atlanta Children's Hospital with COVID-19.
One of our biggest fears when we were pregnant with him was knowing how bad COVID was him getting COVID because of all the unknowns about it and not knowing what to expect and hearing all the stories on how bad people with COVID is and how people are dying.
Although Baker had relatively mild symptoms, doctors still decided to hospitalize him due to his young age.
I'm just glad that it's not as bad with him, and I think it has a lot to do with us being fully vaccinated and me getting vaccinated while I was pregnant with him.
As of mid-January, about 8.5 million U.S. children had tested positive for the coronavirus. About 11% of those cases were confirmed during a 2-week period in January of 2022. While children generally have milder symptoms, the speed at which Omicron spreads is overstraining the system.
This Omicron wave has really been, we have matched our worst Delta wave with hospitalizations, and then even more than that are clinic visits for what might be considered mild cases, but it's overwhelming clinics and emergency departments with just the number of kids coming in with fevers and real sore throats, and it's just a large volume of visits.
Children under 5 remain one of the most vulnerable groups because vaccines have yet to be approved for this youngest age group. As a result, many parents are opting to not send their little ones to daycare and pre-K. Yelena Wheeler, mother of 5-year-old CJ and 8-year-old Cambria, is among them.
And now the school districts are like, we don't have funds. we're not going to do mandatory testing. And so come send your child. We can't guarantee it's safe. I mean, we understand nothing is guaranteed safe, but it's one thing if all other districts were not doing mandatory testing, but one of our biggest districts right next door to us, 3 blocks away from here, LAUSD, has mandatory testing, and we don't.
But for other parents, COVID is now a part of life, and there is not much that can be done to avoid it altogether.
I'm not worried about it all. I want them to be open. I want my kid to go to school. In fact, I think schools, now that vaccines are widely available, the officials should start thinking about making school normal again.
In early January, U.S. Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona encouraged schools in the country to remain open for in-person learning. Many authorities recognize that online education has been hard on both children and parents, and that every school district is different.
I don't think that this is the time to have any one-size-fits-all on this. I think communities are seeing this classroom by classroom and school by school, how they need to continue to adjust to keep things reopened.
By mid-January, 64% of teenagers aged 12 to 17 in the U.S. were fully vaccinated, according to the CDC. Authorities are encouraging parents of younger children to vaccinate their younger kids aged 5 to 12, as doctors are preparing to deal with the rising surge in younger patients. For Maria Cruz in Washington, NRI's VOA News.
To discuss the COVID situation in America, we still have Voice of America's correspondent Chris Casquejo with us on this broadcast from Washington. Chris, thanks for staying on. Now, one of the Biden administration's top medical advisors, Dr. Fauci, of course, reports some encouraging news on the Omicron surge in the United States. Tell us more about that.
Dr. Fauci says the Omicron outbreak has peaked and is turning around specifically in the northeastern part of the country in New York City and in the upper Midwest in Chicago. Here in Washington, D.C. and southern and western states, where there are still surging Omicron cases, some of them are starting to see leveling off of those cases. Dr. Fauci also pointed to the number of high-quality masks now available to Americans, the plan to deliver by mail 1 billion at-home rapid COVID-19 tests, the availability of 5 antiviral treatments, and the wide availability of vaccines to support President Biden's statement that we're much better off than a year ago. And Dr. Fauci again stressed the importance of getting vaccinated, citing the data that shows a vast difference in the severity of symptoms and hospitalization rates among the vaccinated and the unvaccinated.
Right. Chris, just wrapping up our discussion here, the Lunar New Year celebrations are set to take place in many Southeast Asian countries on February 1st. So how are Asian Americans in major cities across the U.S. planning to celebrate, especially amid the pandemic?
While some of the annual Lunar New Year's parades and festivals in the United States are canceled as they were last year, but the San Francisco Chinatown Parade, which is a big one, resumes after a one-year gap. LA's Chinatown also plans to resume its parade, but the events here in D.C. will be virtual this year. The Lunar New Year is usually also a busy time for Chinatown businesses and restaurants, but not this year due to the pandemic and the Omicron variant. One San Francisco restaurant owner reports 90% of his parties canceled for Lunar New Year, but his restaurant plans to stay open and he expects a surge in takeout orders as families decide instead to celebrate at home. Stores that sell ritual and specialty items from China have been hit hard by supply chain issues, resulting in shortages of some holiday goods and specialty foods. Priyanka?
Chris Casquejo, thanks so much for joining us on this special broadcast with all those insights.